For 18 months, everyone at Grimwood Plantation believed that the 4-pound iron collar around Amos Walker's neck was simply a punishment instrument. Master Josiah Grimwood even bragged about it as the most effective method of controlling rebellious Negroes. A forged iron collar 3 inches wide, locked with a padlock, equipped with 4 sharp prongs that prevented the slave from laying his head down to rest. For a year and a half, 36-year-old Amos Walker carried that brutal weight without complaint, bent over Georgia cotton, sleeping sitting up against walls, the skin of his neck rotting into purulent wounds. 9 different overseers supervised him during this period, each more cruel than the previous, all believing the collar had broken him completely. But on the night of October 28, 1837, while head overseer Silas Dockery and his 8 subordinates gathered in the barn to drink whiskey and plan the next public discipline session, the truth revealed itself in terrifying fashion. Amos Walker had not been broken by the collar. For 18 months, he had secretly strengthened his neck and shoulder muscles carrying that weight, transforming 4 pounds of iron from symbol of oppression into deadly weapon. And for 18 months, he observed, memorized, and waited. Each overseer had a routine. Each had a moment of vulnerability. Each would have his collar. But to understand how a man transforms an instrument of torture into an execution device, we must first understand the world that created both the collar and the man who wore it. We must go back to March 15, 1836, to Grimwood Plantation in Wilkes County, Georgia, where Amos Walker first arrived in chains. Grimwood Plantation sprawled across 3,200 acres of prime Georgia cottonland in the heart of the Black Belt, that fertile crescent of dark soil stretching across the deep South, where cotton grew thick and slavery flourished without mercy. The plantation sat 12 miles northeast of Washington, the county seat, along the banks of Fishing Creek, where the water ran slow and brown. Master Josiah Grimwood owned 173 slaves who worked his cotton fields from dawn until well past dusk during picking season. The plantation produced an average of 400 bales per year, each bale weighing 500 pounds of raw cotton worth $60 on the Augusta market. Do the mathematics. $24,000 annually in cotton revenue alone, not counting tobacco, corn, and the profitable side business of breeding and selling slaves. The big house rose 3 stories tall, with white columns and wide verandas that caught whatever breeze might drift across the cotton fields. The slave quarters stretched along the western edge of the property, 2 rows of crude wooden cabins, each housing 8 to 10 people in spaces designed for half that number. Between the big house and the quarters stood the gin house where cotton was processed, the blacksmith shop where tools and restraints were forged, the smokehouse where meat hung, and the whipping post where discipline was administered publicly to ensure all slaves witnessed the consequences of resistance. This was the world Amos Walker entered at age 34, purchased at auction in Augusta for $900, a premium price reflecting his size, strength, and reputation as a skilled field hand. But Amos came with a notation in the auction book that would seal his fate. Rebellious. Previous master reports 2 escape attempts, recommends strict discipline and constant supervision. Josiah Grimwood read that notation and smiled. He specialized in breaking rebellious slaves. In his 23 years as a plantation owner, he had developed a reputation throughout Wilkes County for civilizing the most difficult cases. His methods were legendary, his cruelty was unmatched, and his favorite tool was the iron collar. Amos Walker stood 6 feet 2 inches tall, with shoulders as wide as an ox yoke, muscles hardened by 34 years of forced labor under the Georgia sun. His skin was dark as river clay, his hands calloused and scarred from a lifetime of cotton picking. His face remained impassive, controlled, revealing nothing, a mask of obedience learned through survival. But his eyes, those dark brown eyes, burned with something that no amount of whipping could extinguish: intelligence, observation, memory, and beneath those, buried so deep that most never saw it, rage. He had been born into slavery at a plantation in South Carolina, the son of an African-born mother who remembered her homeland and a father who died under the overseer's whip when Amos was 7 years old. His mother taught him the old ways in secret, how to read the stars, how to identify healing plants and poisonous ones, how to survive by appearing broken while remaining whole inside. She sang spirituals in the Gula dialect, songs that carried coded messages about escape routes and safe harbors. She told him stories of African warriors who never submitted, of revolts and rebellions, of Nat Turner and Denmark Vesey and Gabriel Prosser. She taught him that slavery was not natural, not ordained by God despite what the preachers claimed, but an evil imposed by evil men. When Amos was 12, his mother was sold away. He never saw her again. That loss carved out something inside him, created a hollow space that filled with cold purpose. He learned to read by stealing newspapers and teaching himself in secret. He learned to plan by watching and waiting. He learned patience by surviving 2 decades of bondage without breaking. His first escape attempt came at age 28 in South Carolina. He made it 70 miles north before the dogs caught him. The punishment was 50 lashes and a month in the hotbox, a wooden crate barely large enough to sit in, left in the sun where temperatures reached 120 degrees. He survived. His second escape attempt came at age 32. This time, he made it almost to the North Carolina border before slave catchers tracked him down. The punishment was 100 lashes and sail to the deep south, where escape was nearly impossible and overseers were notoriously brutal. That sail brought him to Augusta, and the auction brought him to Grimwood Plantation, and Grimwood Plantation brought him to the Iron Collar. On his 3rd day at Grimwood, Amos made a mistake. An overseer named Marcus Webb ordered him to work through the noon break without water. The temperature hovered near 95 degrees. Amos had already picked cotton for 7 hours straight. His body needed water. His mind needed rest. When the bell rang for the break, and Webb ordered him to continue, Amos stopped working and looked the overseer directly in the eye. He said nothing. He did nothing threatening. He simply stopped and looked. That was enough. Webb reported the incident to Master Grimwood as insubordination and defiance of direct orders. Grimwood summoned Amos to the whipping post that evening for public discipline, 25 lashes to reinforce the hierarchy. But when Amos was tied to the post and the first lash tore across his back, he did not scream, he did not beg, he made no sound at all. After 25 lashes, Grimwood was furious. The point of public whipping was to break the spirit, to create fear in all who watched. Silence was resistance. Silence was defiance. Silence could not be tolerated. Grimwood ordered 50 more lashes. Amos remained silent. Blood streamed down his back, pooling at his feet. Other slaves watched in horror and awe. The overseers shifted uncomfortably. 75 lashes would kill most men, or at least break them. But Amos Walker stood upright against the post, breathing steadily, his face a mask of calm. That night, Grimwood made a decision. If whipping could not break this slave, another method must be employed. He summoned the plantation blacksmith, a slave named Job, who had no choice but to follow orders, and commissioned a special device, an iron collar. Not the simple neck ring used to prevent escape, but something more elaborate, more cruel. 4 pounds of forged iron, 3 inches wide, fitted with 4 sharp prongs that extended outward and slightly upward. The prongs were positioned so that if the wearer tried to lay his head down in any direction, the prongs would dig into his shoulders or chest or the ground. Sleep would become impossible. Rest would become torture. The collar was locked with a heavy padlock to which only Grimwood held the key. On March 20th, 1836, 5 days after Amos arrived at Grimwood Plantation, the iron collar was fitted around his neck. Job, the blacksmith, wept silently as he hammered the device closed. Amos stood perfectly still. When the lock clicked shut, Grimwood stepped close and whispered with bourbon breath and tobacco-stained teeth, "You will wear this until you learn your place. You will sleep sitting up. You will work with this weight on your neck. And if you try to remove it, I will add chains to your ankles and wrists. Do you understand?" Amos Walker looked at Josiah Grimwood with those burning eyes and spoke for the first time since arriving at the plantation. His voice was deep and steady and carried no hint of submission. "Yes, master, I understand." What Grimwood did not understand was the nature of the man he had just collared. He did not understand that Amos Walker had already survived tortures that would break weaker men. He did not understand that adding physical burden to an already enslaved person sometimes creates the opposite of submission. Sometimes it creates focus. Sometimes it creates purpose. Sometimes it transforms suffering into fuel for an engine that will run until justice is done or the body gives out. The first week with the collar was agony. The 4 pounds of iron pulled constantly at Amos's neck muscles. The prongs cut into his skin whenever he moved too quickly. At night, unable to lay down, he sat with his back against the wall of the quarters, trying to find positions that allowed even brief moments of rest. The other slaves brought him water and food, sneaked him extra rations, tried to help however they could without drawing attention. An elderly slave named Abraham, who had survived 60 years of bondage, sat with Amos one night and shared wisdom that would prove prophetic. "I seen men with collars before," Abraham said quietly, his voice weathered as old wood. "I seen men broken by them, driven mad, killed by infection or exhaustion. But I also seen something else once, long time ago. I seen a man who wore his collar like a crown, wore it with pride, like it was his choice, like he was stronger than the iron. That man scared the master more than any rebel ever did, because you can't break what won't bend. You can't break what's already decided it won't be broken." Amos listened and understood. The collar was not punishment. It was opportunity. 4 pounds of iron permanently attached to his body, 4 pounds that could not be taken away, 4 pounds that, with time and training, could become something other than burden, could become weapon. From that night forward, Amos Walker began his transformation. In the cotton fields under the Georgia sun, he worked with the collar's weight, learning to move with it rather than against it. He developed new muscle groups in his neck and shoulders to carry the load. He discovered that the prongs could be used. If he turned his head sharply, the prongs became short stabbing weapons. If he lowered his head and charged forward, the collar became a battering ram. If he gripped the collar's edges with both hands and twisted, he could generate tremendous torque. But physical adaptation was only part of the plan. The more important work was observation. Amos studied the 9 overseers who supervised fieldwork at Grimwood Plantation with the intensity of a general planning a military campaign. He memorized their routines down to the minute. He noted their habits, their weaknesses, their favorite methods of cruelty, their moments of isolation. Head overseer Silas Dockery was a massive man with a florid face and a voice like gravel. He carried a bullwhip coiled at his belt and used it liberally on any slave who slowed their picking pace. Dockery had a routine. Every morning at 6 o'clock, he walked alone through the cotton gin house, inspecting equipment before the day's work began. He was always alone during this inspection. Always. Second Overseer Marcus Webb, the man who had reported Amos for insubordination, was younger and meaner. Webb enjoyed beating slaves for entertainment, not just discipline. He had a particular hatred for children 3 times in the first month. Amos watched Webb whip enslaved children for minor infractions, like dropping tools or failing to address him properly. Webb had a habit of visiting the slave quarters after dark to terrorize families. He always came alone, believing his authority was protection enough. Third Overseer John Pritchard was thin and nervous, a failed farmer who took this job because he had no other prospects. Pritchard was a coward who only acted cruel when other overseers were watching. Alone, he was timid. He always checked the tobacco barn alone every evening at 7 o'clock, counting the cured leaves and recording inventory in his little book. Fourth Overseer Caleb Stone was a sadist who had been fired from 2 previous plantations for excessive cruelty. Grimwood hired him specifically because of his reputation. Stone's favorite punishment was hamstringing, cutting the tendons in a slave's legs to cripple them permanently. He performed this torture in the blacksmith shop where the forge could be used to cauterize wounds. He always worked alone because even other overseers found his methods disturbing. 5th through 9th overseers were younger men, apprentices learning the trade of slave management. They traveled in pairs usually, supervising smaller work gangs. But Amos noticed that each had at least one moment of isolation per day, during meals, during personal errands, during late-night patrols. For 18 months, Amos collected this information. For 18 months, he strengthened his body under the collar's weight. For 18 months, he maintained his mask of broken obedience while planning 9 murders with meticulous precision. And for 18 months, no one suspected. Not Master Grimwood, who believed the collar had civilized his rebellious slave. Not the overseers, who saw Amos as a defeated man too broken to be dangerous. Not even the other slaves who loved Amos but feared for his sanity under the collar's constant torture. But there were small signs for those who knew how to look. Abraham, the elderly slave, noticed that Amos never complained about the collar anymore. A young woman named Sarah, who brought Amos water in the fields, noticed that his neck muscles had grown thick as tree trunks. Job the blacksmith, who had forged the collar, noticed that Amos sometimes touched the iron almost affectionately, as if it had become part of him rather than a burden weighing him down. The truth was that Amos Walker had achieved something remarkable. He had transcended his torture. The collar no longer defined him as victim. He had redefined the collar as weapon. And he was waiting for the perfect moment to prove it. That moment arrived on October 28, 1837, when a confluence of circumstances created the ideal opportunity for justice. Master Grimwood had travelled to Savannah on business, taking his wife and house slaves with him. They would be gone for 4 days. The plantation was left in the control of head overseer Silas Dockery and his 8 subordinates. Without Grimwood's presence, the overseers relaxed their vigilance. They gathered in the barn that evening to drink whiskey and play cards, laughing about the discipline session they had planned for the following morning, a public whipping of 5 slaves accused of working too slowly, including a pregnant woman and a 12-year-old boy. Amos heard them making these plans during the afternoon work session. He heard Dockery describe how he would personally deliver 50 lashes to the pregnant woman to teach these breeding wenches not to use pregnancy as an excuse for laziness. He heard Marcus Webb volunteer to whip the child to break him early before he develops rebellious tendencies. He heard the others laugh and suggest creative tortures. That night, Amos Walker made his decision. Tomorrow would not come for these 9 men. Their reign of terror would end tonight. Every debt would be paid. Every crime would be answered. And the iron collar, that symbol of oppression, that instrument of torture, that 4-pound reminder of his bondage, would become the instrument of their execution. At 9 o'clock in the evening, after the forced labor of the day ended and slaves returned to their quarters, Amos did something he had not done in 18 months. He laid down. He pressed his neck against the ground and let the collar's prongs dig into the earth. The pressure was immense. The pain was extraordinary, but for the first time since the collar was locked around his neck, Amos Walker rested his head fully against something solid. He closed his eyes. He breathed deeply. He felt the weight of the iron pressing down. And he smiled. Because tomorrow, this weight would crush throats instead of shoulders. These prongs would pierce flesh instead of earth. This collar would strangle instead of constrain. Justice was coming, and it wore 4 pounds of forged iron like a crown. At 10 o'clock, Amos rose and walked silently toward the barn, where the 9 overseers were still drinking and laughing. The October moon hung full and bright in the Georgia sky, casting long shadows across the cotton fields. Amos moved like a shadow himself, decades of survival teaching him how to walk without sound. The collar that had marked him as broken now made him terrifying. A figure moving through moonlight with iron glinting at his throat, his massive frame radiating purpose. His eyes burning with 18 months of accumulated rage, finally unleashed. The barn doors stood partially open. Inside, lantern light flickered. Amos could hear their voices clearly. Dockery was telling a story about a slave he had killed years ago in Alabama, laughing as he described the man's final moments. The others laughed with him. They did not hear Amos approach. They did not hear him stop outside the barn door. They did not hear him whisper a prayer his mother had taught him 30 years ago in the Gullah tongue, a prayer for the ancestors to witness what he was about to do. And then Amos Walker entered the barn. The first to die was Marcus Webb, the man who enjoyed whipping children. He sat closest to the door, chair tilted back, whiskey bottle in hand, still laughing at Dockery's story. He never saw Amos coming, never had time to react. Amos moved with speed that seemed impossible for a man who had carried 4 pounds of iron on his neck for 18 months. But that weight had not weakened him. It had strengthened him, made him faster, more powerful, more deadly. Amos's right hand shot out and gripped the back of Webb's head. His left hand gripped the front of the iron collar. And then, with the full force of shoulders trained by 18 months of burden-bearing, Amos drove Webb's throat directly into the iron collar's edge, while simultaneously pulling the man's head forward. The effect was instantaneous. Webb's windpipe collapsed with an audible crunch. His hyoid bone shattered, his carotid arteries compressed. His eyes bulged in shock and terror as oxygen was cut off. He tried to scream but could produce only a wet, gurgling sound. Amos held the compression for 15 seconds while Webb thrashed and clawed uselessly. The other overseers were only beginning to register what was happening, their whiskey-slowed brains struggling to process the image of their colleague being strangled by a slave using an iron collar as a weapon. By the time they started to rise from their chairs, Webb was dead. Amos released the body and it collapsed to the barn floor, neck bent at an unnatural angle, tongue protruding, your face purple. "Good God!" someone shouted. Chairs scraped. Men scrambled for weapons, whips, clubs, a shotgun propped in the corner. But Amos was already moving. 18 months of observation had taught him exactly how these men would react. He knew who would go for the gun. He knew who would try to run. He knew who would freeze in terror. And he had planned for all of it. John Pritchard, the nervous coward, bolted for the barn door. He almost made it. Amos intercepted him 3 feet from freedom, grabbing the back of Pritchard's shirt and whipping him around with such force that the man's feet left the ground. Before Pritchard could even scream, Amos lowered his head and drove the iron collar's prongs directly into Pritchard's chest. The 4 sharp points, designed to prevent rest, designed to cause constant discomfort, designed to break spirit, now punched through cloth and skin and muscle and bone with devastating efficiency. 1 prong pierced Pritchard's right lung. Another punctured his heart. The 3rd and 4th cracked ribs and tore through tissue. Pritchard's mouth opened in a silent scream as he stared down at the iron embedded in his chest. Blood gushed from the wounds, hot and arterial. Amos twisted the collar, driving the prongs deeper, and felt the exact moment life left the overseer's body. He released him and Pritchard fell, the prongs pulling free with a wet, sucking sound. 2 dead in less than 30 seconds. The remaining 7 overseers were panicking now. Caleb Stone, the hamstringing sadist, the one who cut tendons and enjoyed watching slaves crawl, finally reached the shotgun. His hands shook as he raised it. "Stay back, you black devil, or I'll blow your goddamn head off." Amos Walker stopped, stood perfectly still. Let Stone see him clearly in the lantern light, a 6'2" wall of muscle with an iron collar gleaming at his throat, blood dripping from the prongs, 2 dead overseers at his feet. Amos spoke for only the 2nd time in 18 months, his voice as calm as if commenting on weather. "You won't shoot. That gun hasn't been cleaned in weeks. I watched you check it yesterday. The barrel's fouled. It might fire, might just click. You willing to bet your life on that gun, Mr. Stone?" Stone's eyes widened. His finger trembled on the trigger. The other overseers watched, frozen between hope that the gun would save them and terror that it wouldn't. Amos took 1 step forward. Stone pulled the trigger. Click. The hammer fell on a dud cap. The gun did not fire. And in the half-second of shocked silence that followed, Amos charged. He covered the 12 feet between them in 3 massive strides, lowering his head, the iron collar leading. Stone tried to use the shotgun as a club, but Amos was too fast, too strong, too focused. The collar struck Stone square in the face with the force of a sledgehammer. Nose shattered, teeth exploded, jaw dislocated. Stone flew backward into a support post and crumpled, semi-conscious, bleeding from a dozen facial wounds. But Amos wasn't finished with Caleb Stone. This man had hamstrung 17 slaves during his tenure at Grimwood Plantation. 17 people crippled permanently, forced to crawl like animals for the rest of their lives. Justice required symmetry. Amos grabbed Stone by the hair and dragged him to the barn's center where everyone could see. Stone moaned and tried to resist, but his broken face made resistance impossible. "You like cutting tendons, Mr. Stone?" Amos asked quietly. "You like watching people crawl?" He positioned Stone's left leg, holding it steady with his knee. Then he gripped the iron collar with both hands, tilted his head, and used one of the prongs like a knife blade. The iron was not sharp like a blade, it was thick and blunt, which made what happened next even more terrible. Amos sawed the prong across the back of Stone's ankle, using the collar's weight and his own strength to cut through skin and muscle and tendon. Stone's screams filled the barn. The cutting took almost a minute. When the Achilles tendon finally severed with a wet pop, Stone's foot went limp. Amos did the same to the right ankle. By the time he finished, Stone had passed out from pain. Amos left him bleeding on the barn floor, alive but crippled, experiencing exactly what he had inflicted on others. 3 overseers down, 6 remaining. The others tried to rush Amos all at once. A desperate coordinated attack. It almost worked. Almost. Young Overseer Daniel Fletcher tackled Amos from behind, wrapping arms around his torso. Overseer Peter Larson aimed a kick at Amos's knee. Overseer Thomas Grant swung a wooden club at Amos's head. For a moment they had him pinned, but they had forgotten about the collar. Or perhaps they had never truly understood it. Amos bent forward sharply, using Fletcher's weight as leverage, and the iron prongs on the front of the collar stabbed backward into Fletcher's arms. Fletcher screamed and released his grip. Amos spun, grabbed Larson's extended leg, and pulled him off balance. As Larson fell, Amos stomped down with his full weight on the man's knee. The joint bent sideways with a crack. Larson shrieked. Thomas Grant's club connected with the side of Amos's head, a solid blow that would have knocked out most men. Blood streamed from a cut above Amos's eye. For a moment his vision blurred, but pain was an old friend. Pain had been his companion for 18 months. Pain was meaningless. Amos shook his head to clear his vision and turned to Grant. Grant swung the club again. Amos caught it with his left hand, stopping the swing cold. With his right hand, he grabbed the back of Grant's neck and pulled the man forward while simultaneously lowering his head. Grant's face met the iron collar's edge at the point of Amos's chin. The impact broke Grant's nose, split his lips, shattered his front teeth. Amos pulled Grant's head down further, forcing the man into a bent position, then wrapped both arms around Grant's head in a vice grip, pressing Grant's throat firmly against the iron collar's edge. Grant struggled, kicked, clawed at Amos's arms, but Amos held firm, using the collar as a garrote, the iron edge crushing Grant's windpipe. This death took longer than Webb's, nearly a minute of choking, convulsing, fighting for breath that would never come. When Grant finally went limp, Amos released him and let the body drop. Daniel Fletcher was clutching his punctured arms, trying to stop the bleeding. Peter Larson was rolling on the ground, holding his shattered knee, sobbing. Neither was a threat anymore. Amos left them and turned his attention to the 3 overseers who had not yet engaged, Silas Dockery, the head overseer, and 2 others named Robert Church and Samuel Pike. These 3 had backed toward the far end of the barn, creating distance. Dockery still held his bullwhip. Church and Pike had grabbed pitchforks from a tool rack. They formed a defensive line, weapons ready, terror in their eyes, but desperation making them dangerous. "You're dead, Amos," Dockery said, his voice trying for authority but cracking slightly. "You know that, right? Even if you kill all of us, you're dead. They'll hunt you down. They'll torture you for weeks before they kill you. They'll make an example that'll terrify every slave in Georgia." Amos Walker smiled, not a grin, not a laugh. Just a small, cold smile that held no humor at all. "Been dead for 36 years, Mr. Dockery. Every day since I was born into slavery, I've been dead. Can't kill what's already dead. But you're about to find out what dying really feels like." He advanced. Dockery cracked the bullwhip, a weapon he had used on hundreds of slaves, a tool of terror and control. The whip lashed out, aiming for Amos's face. But Amos had watched Dockery use this whip for 18 months, had studied the timing, the distance, the technique. He knew exactly when and how the whip would strike. As the leather cord came toward him, Amos raised his left arm and let the whip wrap around his forearm. The tip cracked against his skin, drawing blood. He ignored it. Then Amos pulled. Dockery, surprised, stumbled forward as Amos reeled in the whip like a fisherman landing a catch. Before Dockery could release the whip handle, Amos had closed the distance. He grabbed Dockery's whip hand and twisted it behind the overseer's back in one smooth motion. Dockery cried out. Amos positioned himself behind the larger man and wrapped his right arm around Dockery's throat. The iron collar pressed against the back of Dockery's skull. "This collar," Amos said quietly, his mouth close to Dockery's ear, "has been on my neck for 18 months. 18 months of agony, 18 months of sleeping sitting up, 18 months of pain every time I moved. And you know what? I want to thank you for it, because this collar is what's going to kill you now." Amos tightened his arm in a chokehold, while simultaneously pulling Dockery's head back against the iron collar's rear edge. The pressure was immense. Dockery thrashed wildly, his superior size and weight meaningless against Amos's leverage and 18 months of strength training. The iron collar dug into the base of Dockery's skull, compressing blood vessels, cutting off oxygen. Dockery's face turned red, then purple. His eyes bulged, his tongue protruded. He made horrible gagging sounds. Amos held the chokehold for a full minute after Dockery stopped moving, making absolutely certain the head overseer was dead. Then he released the body and let it collapse. Robert Church and Samuel Pike broke. They dropped their pitchforks and ran for the barn door. They made it outside and sprinted across the moonlit yard toward the big house, screaming for help that would not come. Master Grimwood was in Savannah. The house slaves were with him. The only people at the plantation were 173 slaves who had no intention of stopping what was happening. Many watched from the quarters' windows. Many witnessed the two overseers running for their lives, pursued by a man wearing an iron collar and carrying vengeance in his hands. Amos caught Robert Church halfway to the big house. Church tried to fight, threw wild punches that Amos absorbed without flinching. Amos grabbed Church by the throat with his left hand and lifted the man completely off the ground. Church's feet kicked uselessly at air. His hands clawed at Amos's wrist. His face turned colors. And then Amos brought his right hand up, gripped the front edge of the iron collar, and used it like a blade, driving the collar's edge into Church's throat with savage force. The trachea collapsed. The neck bones cracked. Church's body went limp. Amos dropped him in the dirt. Samuel Pike had made it to the big house porch, scrambling to open the locked front door, pounding and screaming, even though he knew no one was inside. He heard footsteps behind him and turned to see Amos Walker climbing the porch steps slowly, deliberately, blood-covered and relentless. Pike pulled a knife from his belt, a small blade used for cutting tobacco. "Stay back! I'm warning you!" Amos stopped at the top of the steps. He looked at Pike, then he looked at the knife, then he looked back at Pike. "You think that knife scares me? I've had 4 pounds of iron locked around my neck for 18 months. I've been whipped, starved, worked to exhaustion every single day. And you think a little knife is going to stop me now?" He advanced. Pike stabbed at him. The blade caught Amos in the left shoulder, sinking 2 inches deep. Amos did not even flinch. He grabbed Pike's knife hand, broke the wrist with a sharp twist, and took the knife. Pike screamed. Amos gripped the collar with one hand, lowered his head, and drove the prongs into Pike's stomach. The 4 points pierced deep. Amos lifted Pike off the ground, the man's weight suspended on the collar's prongs, embedded in his abdomen. Pike's screams turned to gurgles as internal damage took its toll. Amos held him there for 30 seconds, watching the life drain from Pike's eyes, then let him slide off the prongs and collapse on the big house porch, 8 dead, 1 crippled and bleeding in the barn. Amos walked back to the barn slowly. His body ached. The knife wound in his shoulder throbbed. The club blow to his head had given him a concussion. Blood covered him from head to foot, some his own, mostly belonging to 9 overseers, but he felt no pain. Or rather, he felt pain, but it was insignificant compared to the satisfaction of justice delivered, debts paid, symmetry achieved. Inside the barn, Caleb Stone had regained consciousness and was trying to crawl toward the door, dragging his severed tendons behind him, leaving a trail of blood. Daniel Fletcher sat against a wall, his punctured arms still bleeding. Peter Larson had passed out from the pain of his shattered knee. Amos stood in the barn doorway, his silhouette framed by moonlight, the iron collar glinting. He looked at Stone crawling pathetically across the floor. This man who had crippled 17 people and enjoyed watching them crawl. The symmetry was perfect. Amos decided to let him live, let him crawl for the rest of his life, let him experience exactly what he had inflicted on others. But Fletcher and Larson were different. They were younger overseers, not yet as sadistic as the others, but still guilty, still complicit, still agents of oppression. Amos walked to Fletcher first. The young overseer looked up with terrified eyes. "Please, I have a wife, a baby daughter." "So did I," Amos said quietly. "Had a mother who was sold away, had a father who was beaten to death, had friends who were whipped, raped, worked to death, sold like cattle. Everyone has people they love. That didn't stop you from whipping children. That didn't stop you from participating in their torture." He placed his hands on either side of Fletcher's head and pushed the man's throat directly against the iron collar's edge. Fletcher struggled briefly, then went limp. Amos held the pressure for 30 more seconds to be sure. Peter Larson was unconscious, in shock from his injuries. Amos knelt beside him. For a moment he considered mercy, considered letting this one live. But then he remembered the pregnant woman scheduled for 50 lashes in the morning, remembered the 12-year-old boy scheduled for whipping, remembered every slave child who had cried themselves to sleep under the overseer's cruelty. Mercy was a luxury slaves were never afforded. Mercy was for the powerful to grant. And tonight, Amos was powerful. He pressed the iron collar against Larson's throat and held it there until no pulse remained. 9 overseers dead, all killed using the iron collar, that instrument of torture transformed into weapon of justice. Each death had employed the collar differently. Strangulation, stabbing, blunt force trauma, garroting. But always the collar, always the 4 pounds of iron that Josiah Grimwood had locked around Amos Walker's neck, believing it would break him. That iron had not broken Amos. It had forged him, made him stronger, made him deadly, made him inevitable. Amos walked out of the barn into the October night. The moon still shone bright. The cotton fields stretched silver in the moonlight, and for the first time in 18 months, Amos Walker laid down. He laid down on the grass outside the barn and pressed his neck against the earth and let the collar's prongs dig into the ground. The iron pressed down on him, but now it felt different. Now it felt like victory. Now it felt like justice. Now it felt like freedom. Not freedom from slavery, not yet, but freedom from helplessness, freedom from victimhood, freedom from submission. Around the plantation, slaves emerged from their quarters. They gathered slowly, cautiously, forming a circle around Amos. Abraham, the elderly slave, approached first. He knelt beside Amos and placed a weathered hand on the younger man's shoulder. "What you did tonight. Lord have mercy, what you did tonight." "Was it wrong?" Amos asked, his voice hoarse from exertion. Abraham was quiet for a long moment. Then he spoke words that would echo through slave communities across Georgia for decades. "Wrong? Right? I don't know no more. All I know is 9 devils went to hell tonight, and 1 angel of vengeance walks the earth wearing an iron crown. That's all I know." Other slaves gathered closer. Sarah brought water and cloth to clean Amos's wounds. Job, the blacksmith, examined the collar, shaking his head in awe at how it had been used. A woman named Ruth began singing a spiritual "Go Down Moses," and others joined in. The song filled the night, carried across cotton fields, announced to anyone listening that something profound had happened at Grimwood Plantation. Amos lay on the ground and listened to the singing and felt the collar pressing against his neck and knew that his life was effectively over. Master Grimwood would return in 3 days. Authorities would be summoned. Possess would be formed. Bloodhounds would be released. And Amos Walker, a slave who killed 9 white overseers, a capital crime punishable by the most brutal execution Georgia law allowed, would be hunted down and made an example of. But in that moment, lying beneath the Georgia stars, listening to spirituals sung by people who understood his pain, Amos felt something he had not felt in 36 years. Peace, not happiness, not joy, but peace. The peace that comes from knowing you fought back. The peace that comes from knowing you refused to be broken. The peace that comes from choosing your own path, even when that path leads to destruction. He closed his eyes and slept. For the first time in 18 months, Amos Walker slept lying down. The collar's prongs dug into the earth and grass and created small divots. But Amos's head rested flat against the ground, and in his dreams he saw his mother's face, and she was smiling. The discovery came 3 days later when Master Josiah Grimwood returned from Savannah. His carriage rolled up the plantation road expecting the usual orderly scene. Cotton fields active with workers, overseers supervising, the plantation machine functioning efficiently. Instead, he found silence. The cotton fields were empty, no overseers visible. The barn doors stood open. Something was profoundly wrong. Grimwood climbed from his carriage, his wife remaining inside as he approached the barn cautiously. The smell hit him first. Blood and death, thick and nauseating. He pushed the barn doors wider and stepped inside. What he found would haunt him for the rest of his life. 9 bodies, some sprawled on the barn floor, some arranged outside, all dead in various states of violence. His overseers, the men he trusted to manage his plantation, to control his human property, to maintain order, massacred. The head overseer, Silas Dockery, lay with neck twisted, tongue protruding, face purple. Marcus Webb's throat showed crush injuries. John Pritchard had puncture wounds in his chest. Thomas Grant's face was destroyed, throat crushed. The others showed similar fatal trauma. And in the center of the barn floor, Caleb Stone lay alive but crippled, his Achilles tendons severed, unable to stand, crying softly. "What happened?" Grimwood demanded, his voice shaking. "Who did this?" Stone looked up with haunted eyes. "The collar. The iron collar. Amos Walker. He used the collar. We never imagined the collar." Grimwood didn't wait to hear more. He ran from the barn, shouting for his driver. "Get the sheriff! Get the militia! Get everyone! Now!" But when he looked toward the slave quarters, he saw them. All 173 slaves standing in organized rows, facing the big house. Silent. Unmoving. And at the front of this human formation stood Amos Walker, the iron collar still locked around his neck, blood-stained but standing tall, his eyes fixed on Master Grimwood with an expression that combined defiance and calm acceptance. Grimwood stared at his slaves. They stared back. Neither side moved. The air crackled with tension, with possibility, with the fundamental question that had driven American slavery since its inception. What happens when the oppressed refuse to be oppressed? What happens when the enslaved choose to be enslaved no more? Grimwood broke first. He retreated to his carriage, ordered his driver to race to Washington, to raise the alarm, to bring help. As the carriage fled down the plantation road, Amos Walker and 173 freed slaves watched it disappear in a cloud of dust. What came next was inevitable. The sheriff arrived with 20 armed men. The Georgia militia was summoned, 60 soldiers with rifles and bayonets. Posses formed from neighboring plantations, slave owners terrified that rebellion might spread. Bloodhounds were brought from 3 counties. By nightfall on the third day after Grimwood's return, Grimwood Plantation was surrounded by over 100 armed white men determined to recapture the slaves and execute Amos Walker. But the slaves did not run. They did not hide. They stood their ground, gathered in the cotton fields, armed with tools, hoes, axes, hammers, whatever they could find. They knew they could not win. They knew the military force arrayed against them was overwhelming. But Amos Walker's act of vengeance had transformed something inside them. It had shown them that resistance was possible, that fighting back was an option, that dying on your feet was preferable to living on your knees. The standoff lasted 3 days. Negotiators tried to convince the slaves to surrender. Preachers quoted Bible verses about obedience. The sheriff promised lenient treatment if they gave up Amos Walker. The slaves refused every offer. They sent their own message back. "We will not return to bondage. We will not surrender our brother. If you want him, come take him, but we will fight." On the evening of the third day, Georgia's governor sent new orders. No negotiation. Use force. Recapture the slaves. Execute Amos Walker publicly. Make an example that would prevent future rebellions across the entire South. That night, the militia prepared to attack at dawn. But Amos Walker had a different plan. As night fell, he gathered the slaves one final time. He stood before them, the iron collar still locked around his neck, and spoke with quiet authority. "You've shown courage these past days, more courage than anyone ever asked of you, but tomorrow they will attack, and many of you will die. Your children will die. That is not justice, that is massacre." "We won't surrender you," Abraham said, voicing the consensus. "Not after what you did for us." "You won't have to," Amos replied. "I'm going to walk out to them tonight, alone. I'll surrender. They'll execute me, but you will live. You'll return to the plantation, yes, back to slavery, but you'll live. Your children will live. And someday, maybe someday soon, slavery will end. When it does, you'll be alive to see freedom. That's worth more than dying tomorrow in a battle we can't win." The slaves protested, argued, begged him not to surrender. But Amos was firm. He had made his decision. Justice had been served. 9 overseers were dead. He had shown that slaves could fight back, could resist, could transform instruments of oppression into weapons of liberation. That was enough. His story would spread. Other slaves would hear about the man who wore an iron collar and used it to kill his tormentors. That story would inspire resistance for decades to come. His death would have meaning. At midnight, Amos Walker walked alone from Grimwood Plantation toward the militia lines. He carried no weapon. His hands were raised. The iron collar gleamed in moonlight. Soldiers saw him coming and raised their rifles. Officers shouted orders. Torches were lit, and Amos Walker, formerly enslaved, now legend, walked steadily forward into the light. "I am Amos Walker," he called out in a strong, clear voice. "I killed 9 overseers at Grimwood Plantation 3 days ago. I surrender myself for trial and whatever punishment Georgia law demands, but I want it known. I am not sorry. I am not repentant. Those 9 men terrorized innocent people. They tortured. They murdered. They destroyed families. What I did was justice, not the law's justice. Not white man's justice, but justice nonetheless. And if I could do it again, I would." They seized him immediately. Chains were locked around his wrists and ankles, but they left the iron collar in place, partially because no one had the key, partially because it had become so identified with Amos that removing it seemed wrong somehow. He was taken to the Washington jail, imprisoned under heavy guard, and held for trial. The trial was a spectacle. Held in the Wilkes County Courthouse, it drew observers from across Georgia. Plantation owners came to witness the fate of a rebellious slave. Abolitionists from the North sent reporters to document the proceedings. Even slaves from neighboring plantations were brought to watch, a deliberate attempt to terrorize them into submission by showing what happened to those who resisted. The verdict was never in question. Amos had confessed. The evidence was overwhelming. The only question was the method of execution. Georgia law allowed several options for capital punishment of slaves: hanging, burning at the stake, or a relatively new method called breaking on the wheel, where the convicted person's limbs were systematically shattered with iron bars before final execution. The judge chose hanging, but with a modification. Amos Walker would wear the iron collar to his execution. It would remain locked around his neck during the hanging. The symbolism was deliberate. The collar that Amos had transformed into a weapon would now serve its original purpose one final time as an instrument of oppression. The execution was scheduled for November 10th, 1837, 2 weeks after the killing of the 9 overseers. It would be conducted publicly in the Washington Town Square. Attendance was mandatory for all slaves within 20 miles. They would be forced to watch to reinforce the consequences of rebellion. On the morning of November 10th, Amos Walker was led from his cell in chains, the iron collar still locked around his neck. He had lost weight during his imprisonment. The collar hung slightly loose now, no longer pressing as tightly. His wounds from the night of violence had mostly healed, leaving scars. His face showed no fear, no regret, only calm acceptance. The gallows stood 12 feet high in the center of the town square. A massive crowd had gathered, hundreds of white spectators eager to witness the execution, and more than 200 slaves forced to attend and watch. Amos was led up the stairs to the platform. The hangman fitted the noose over his head, the rope settling above the iron collar. A preacher offered to say final prayers. Amos declined. "Any last words?" the sheriff asked. Amos Walker looked out at the crowd. He looked at the white faces filled with satisfaction that order was being restored. He looked at the black faces filled with sorrow and something else. Pride, perhaps. Recognition. Understanding that sometimes resistance requires sacrifice. "I wore this collar for 18 months, Amos said, his voice carrying across the silent square. "It was meant to break me, to teach me my place, to remind me every moment of every day that I was property, not a person. But it didn't break me. It taught me something different. It taught me that oppression is a choice, that submission is a choice, and that resistance is also a choice. I chose resistance. I chose justice. I chose to transform this collar from symbol of slavery into weapon of liberation, and I would choose it again." He paused, looking directly at the enslaved people forced to witness his execution. "To my brothers and sisters in chains, remember this collar. Remember that tools of oppression can become weapons of freedom. Remember that we are not property, we are people. We have dignity, we have rights. And someday, maybe not today, maybe not this year, but someday we will be free. Until then, resist. In small ways, in large ways, in any ways you can, resist, because the master's greatest fear is not that we will rebel. It's that we will refuse to be broken. That's what this collar taught me, and that's what I want you to remember." The sheriff signaled. The hangman pulled the lever. The trapdoor opened. Amos Walker dropped. But something went wrong. The rope was too long, or Amos's weight was miscalculated, or perhaps some force larger than human planning intervened. Instead of the neck breaking cleanly, the intended merciful quick death, Amos dropped far enough that his feet touched the ground. The noose tightened around his neck above the iron collar, choking him slowly rather than killing him instantly. He stood on his toes, struggling for air, the rope and collar working together to strangle him gradually. The crowd gasped. The hangman panicked, unsure what to do. Protocol required the condemned to hang suspended until dead, but Amos was touching ground, prolonging his death into torture. For 5 minutes, Amos Walker struggled on his toes, the rope and collar crushing his throat, his face turning purple, his eyes bulging, his body convulsing. Slaves watching wept openly. Some white spectators turned away, disturbed by the prolonged suffering. Finally, after what witnesses later described as the longest 5 minutes of their lives, Amos Walker's legs gave out. His weight pulled him down far enough that the noose tightened completely, finishing what it had started. He hung there, suspended now, the iron collar visible around his neck, the rope above it. His body swayed slightly in the November breeze. And then he was still. The hangman left the body hanging for 6 hours, as was customary, a warning to all who might consider rebellion. The slaves forced to watch were made to stand in the square for all 6 hours, staring at Amos Walker's body, the iron collar still locked around his dead neck, the symbol that had defined his final 18 months still with him, even in death. But something unexpected happened during those 6 hours. What was meant to terrorize became something else. The slaves watching began to see not a warning but a victory. Yes, Amos had been executed. Yes, the law had asserted its power, but Amos had also won. He had transformed his collar. He had killed 9 oppressors. He had shown that resistance was possible. He had died unbroken, unbowed. His final words a call to continued resistance. His death became martyr's death. His collar became symbol of transformation. When the 6 hours finally ended and slaves were released to return to their plantations, something had changed. They walked differently, carried themselves differently. The terror that authorities hoped to instill had backfired. Instead of crushing resistance, Amos Walker's execution had inspired it. Word of what happened at Grimwood Plantation spread across the South through the complex network of communication slaves had developed. The grapevine telegraph, as they called it. Traveling slaves carried the story from plantation to plantation. Hired-out slaves shared it in cities. Visiting preachers whispered it in hush harbors where slaves held secret religious services. And with each telling, the story grew, evolved, became legend. In Virginia, slaves sang new verses to old spirituals. Walk with Walker, wear his crown, iron collar, bring Massa down. In South Carolina, the story of the iron collar became cautionary tale told to young overseers. Watch the quiet ones, watch the strong ones, watch the ones you think you've broken. In Alabama, a slave named Benjamin led a rebellion that killed 2 overseers, explicitly citing Amos Walker as inspiration. In Louisiana, a group of escaped slaves formed a maroon community and called themselves the Iron Collars. Master Josiah Grimwood never recovered from the events at his plantation. He sold Grimwood Plantation within a year, unable to bear the memory of what happened there. The iron collar worn by Amos Walker became an object of dark fascination. Some claimed Grimwood kept it as a reminder, others said it was melted down and reforged into tools. But the truth is, no one knows. The collar disappeared into history. Only its legend remained. The 173 slaves who witnessed Amos's vengeance and stood with him during the 3-day standoff were eventually dispersed, sold to different plantations across Georgia, separated to prevent organized resistance. But they carried the story with them, and the story did what stories do. It survived, spread, transformed, inspired. Historians largely ignored the Grimwood Plantation incident for over a century. The official records are sparse. Court documents recording the trial and execution, newspaper articles describing a Negro uprising quickly suppressed, plantation records showing the sale of the property. No one wanted to give Amos Walker's story prominence. To do so would acknowledge that slaves were capable of strategic resistance, of transforming oppression into liberation, of winning even in defeat. But in slave communities, the story persisted. It was passed down through generations, shared in whispers, preserved in coded songs and folk tales. After the Civil War, when former slaves gave testimonies about their experiences, several mentioned hearing about the man who wore the iron collar and killed 9 devils. In the 20th century, scholars doing oral history projects recorded interviews with descendants of slaves who remembered family stories about Amos Walker. The historical significance of the Grimwood Plantation incident extends beyond the 9 deaths. It represents a form of resistance that terrified slave owners more than open rebellion. Open rebellion could be crushed with military force, but strategic, intelligent, patient resistance, the transformation of oppression's tools into weapons of liberation, was harder to combat. How do you prevent a slave from turning his collar into a weapon? How do you control someone who has decided that death is preferable to submission? The iron collar became a powerful symbol in abolitionist literature. Frederick Douglass, himself an escaped slave and prominent abolitionist, reference the Grimwood incident in several speeches. They put iron on our necks to weigh us down and wondered why we used that iron to rise up. Harriet Beecher Stowe considered including a character based on Amos Walker in Uncle Tom's Cabin, but ultimately decided the violence was too extreme for her intended audience. The incident also had impact on slave owners' psychology. Insurance rates for plantation overseers increased significantly across Georgia after November 1837. Many plantations reduced their use of iron collars, not out of mercy, but from fear. Slave codes were tightened. Georgia passed laws limiting the number of overseers who could gather in one location, requiring them to be armed at all times, mandating that slaves wearing restraint devices be kept under constant supervision. But perhaps the most important legacy was psychological. Amos Walker's story proved to enslaved people that they were not helpless, that oppression could be resisted, that instruments of torture could become tools of justice, that even in a system designed to crush human dignity, dignity could survive and even triumph. His 18 months of patient preparation showed that resistance didn't require impulsive action. It could be strategic, calculated, inevitable. The story also revealed something about the nature of oppression itself. Josiah Grimwood believed an iron collar would break Amos Walker's spirit. He believed that sufficient brutality would create submission. But he failed to understand a fundamental truth about human nature. Sometimes increasing oppression doesn't break people. Sometimes it focuses them. Sometimes it transforms them into exactly the weapon the oppressor fears most. Contemporary relevance echoes through American history. The pattern of transforming oppression's tools into liberation's weapons repeats across decades and centuries. From enslaved people using their masters' own laws against them to secure freedom, to civil rights activists using non-violent resistance to expose violence, to modern movements reclaiming derogatory terms and symbols as sources of pride and power, Amos Walker's strategy of transformation endures. His story reminds us that systems of oppression contain within them the seeds of their own destruction. Every tool of control, every instrument of torture, every symbol of submission can potentially be transformed. The collar meant to break became the weapon that liberated. The 18 months meant to destroy created the strength to resist. The execution, meant to terrorize, became martyrdom that inspired. We remember Amos Walker not because he killed 9 men, though he did, and they deserved their deaths for the cruelties they inflicted. We remember him because he refused to accept the identity oppression tried to impose on him, because he transformed his suffering into strategy, because he showed that enslaved people were not helpless victims, but active agents capable of resistance, planning, and justice, because he died unbroken. The iron collar that Josiah Grimwood locked around Amos Walker's neck on March 20th, 1836 was meant to last until Amos learned his place. It lasted until November 10th, 1837, not because Amos learned his place, but because he taught his oppressors theirs. He taught them that every slave wearing a collar was potentially a warrior wearing armor, that every field hand was potentially a general planning campaigns, that every broken-looking body potentially contained unbreakable spirit. In the final accounting, 9 white men died and 1 black man was executed. By the law's calculation, justice was served. Order was restored. The system continued, but by a different calculation, the calculation made by enslaved people across the South who heard this story and felt something shift inside them. 9 devils went to hell, and 1 angel of vengeance went to glory. And the iron collar, that symbol of oppression, was transformed forever into symbol of resistance. Today, when we confront systems of injustice, when we feel crushed by structures of oppression, when we wear metaphorical collars that mark us as less than human, we can remember Amos Walker. Remember that oppression's tools can be transformed, that patience and strategy can overcome brutality and force, that resistance is always possible, that dying free is better than living enslaved, and that sometimes what's meant to break us makes us stronger instead. His final words echo across nearly 2 centuries. Tools of oppression can become weapons of freedom. We are not property. We are people. We have dignity. We have rights. Resist. The iron collar was meant to be his prison. He made it his crown. And in doing so, he showed every person facing oppression that transformation is possible. Resistance is viable, and freedom, even if it costs everything, is worth fighting for. Remember Amos Walker. Remember the iron collar. Remember that what's meant to break you can make you stronger. Remember that justice delayed is not justice denied if you're willing to be patient, strategic, and absolutely relentless in your pursuit of it. Remember that even in the darkest moments of oppression, the human spirit cannot be fully crushed. It bends, it adapts, it transforms, and sometimes it strikes back. 9 overseers learned this lesson on October 28, 1837. Georgia learned it during the trial and execution. The South learned it as the story spread and inspired other acts of resistance. And we can learn it today, that oppression is not inevitable, submission is not required, and the tools meant to control us can become the weapons of our liberation. This is the legacy of Amos Walker, the man who wore an iron collar for 18 months and used it to kill 9 men. This is the story that Georgia tried to bury but couldn't. This is the truth that slavery tried to crush but failed. Amos Walker transformed his torture into triumph, his collar into crown, his death into martyrdom, and his execution into inspiration. And that transformation, that refusal to be broken, that commitment to resistance, that willingness to die rather than submit, is the real terror that slaveholders feared. Not the 9 dead overseers, but the thousands of enslaved people who heard this story and realized that they too could transform their collars into crowns. If you found this story powerful, if it moved you or changed your perspective on resistance and justice, please subscribe to this channel, share this video with others who need to hear these untold stories, and leave a comment below. What lessons do you take from Amos Walker's story? How do we apply his example of transforming oppression into resistance in our modern struggles for justice? Let's continue this conversation, and let's never forget those like Amos Walker, who refused to be broken and showed us that freedom is always worth fighting for. Before we go, I want to give a special thank you to our Gold Club member, Terry Bailey, Angela Taylor, and Cassandra Michelle Johnson for making this content possible. Your support keeps these important stories alive. If you'd like to join Terry in supporting this channel, check out the membership options below. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next story. Want to see your name featured at the end of our videos and get early access to new content? Become a Gold Club member today.